So instead of that, if I replace my text box with a content control, and we just use a binding that takes in whatever the current data context is, which is going to be the collection coming out of this collection view source. If we then dump the tree on that content control and run, now we can see something similar. We get down to the grid to the content control, but notice this child element called content presenter. The data context on this, notice we're also dumping what the data context is at a given level so that we can see where that switches in data-bound scenarios. The data context is null on the content presenter because it doesn't have anything to render yet, and we'll see that switch momentarily. But notice that the collection view flows down to the content control, and then the content control is going to render out a content presenter for whatever it's trying to dynamically render. Well, we need to give it a template to be able to render. So how can we set the template of a content control? Well, we could use a number of different ways, but I'm just going to set an explicit template, setting the content template property equal to an instance of a data template containing a text block. That text block is bound to the name property of the product that's being rendered. And because of the way list views work, that was covered in a previous module, even though this binding is pointing to a whole collection, content control is going to render out the current item in that collection. So let's go ahead and run with that. And now we can see in the window behind there, plain cheese is showing up. That's because that's the current product name. If we drill down in the tree now, we can see we get down to the content presenter level, and notice now it does have the data context is that list collection view. But then immediately underneath that, it renders an instance of our text block, and that data context flows down to it. But because the control is designed to work with a single object, it will pick the current object out of that collection and bind against the name property of that current object. So notice the content presenter's role here in a content control. It is the thing that will render out the data template inside of it. Now what if we go with a little more complicated control, such as a list box bound to the entire collection? And in this case, we've got display member path set to name. If we add that and dump that in a tree instead, and go ahead and run, now we can see the dump here behind. You can see the list box is populated. We can start drilling down. Here's our list box. It's got some structure with a border, scroll viewer, grid, etc. Eventually a scroll content presenter, and then notice items presenter. So for a content control, it's a content presenter that renders out the dynamic item. In a items control, it's an items presenter that renders out the dynamic items, plural. But then notice we get down to a level called the virtualizing stack panel, which is the default presenter for a list box. And we can't drill down any deeper because the individual items are being rendered out dynamically in a way that the visual tree helper can't get to. So how can we get to those to visualize their structure? Well, if we go to our list box and add an item template to it and get rid of our display member path, this item template just contains a text block bound to the name property of the product again, similar to what the display member path was doing. But here we can now hook up a loaded event that we can then tap into the object that's raising that event, which will be the text block down inside of the list box, and we can walk the visual tree from there. So let's go hook up this loaded event. So I'll jump into the code behind and add the loaded event here. We only want this to fire once, not once for each item. So I've got a little guard condition here to make sure it only executes once. And then we're going to do the show tree call for that sender object that's raising the event, which will be the individual text block inside of the list box. I'll comment out the other show tree so we don't get two of them popping up, and let's run with that. Now we can expand down, and we can see we get down to the virtualizing stack panel level, but we're actually walking up to that level, so we're able to walk through it. And notice there's a list box item, and also notice the data context switch at this point. So the true container of an item in the list box is a list box item. If it's a combo box, it's a combo box item. If it's a tab control, it's a tab item. So each control has its own item container that it will render out, and that's really the point where it switches from the overall collection to an individual object in that collection as far as the data context. That flows down the visual tree from there, and inside of that is a content presenter because the list box item is effectively a content control. Inside of the content presenter, that's where our data template renders. So you can see now we're able to walk up the visual tree basically from that text blocks in the event handler all the way up and see the internals of what's going on inside this virtualizing stack panel. And it emphasizes that's the point where the data context switches. Now let's take an even more dynamic and complicated data-bound container, a data grid. A data grid is going to render out rows for each object in the collection. Those rows have composite structure of their own. And similar to what I showed with the list box, if I just tried to drill down from the data grid, I wouldn't be able to get past the row level, the items presenter level. So I'm going to play a similar trick here that I'm going to use a templated column, which we'll get into more details on later in the module, and provide a data template containing a text block bound to the description field with a loaded event hooked up on it. I can hook that loaded event and do my tree walk from there, similar to what I just showed with the list box. So let's drop into the code behind, add that event handler. We'll do our show tree on the object that's raising the loaded event, which will be our text block inside of a cell within the data grid. And we've got our guard condition to make sure we only do it once. Let's go ahead and run. And now we can see a data grid showing up there. We can drill our way down. Notice the items presenter in this case is a data grid rows presenter. And this is the level where we wouldn't be able to drill down any farther if we hadn't hooked the event down inside of a data template. But we're really drilling up to that point. So you can see that renders out data grid rows as the containers. Those have some structure to them. Eventually you get to a data grid cells presenter, which contains an items presenter itself. So you've actually got items control behavior at a row level, but then within a row, you've got items control rendering of the individual cells within the row. Notice in terms of data context switching, the context switch happens at a row level. The entire row's data context is the product, and from there down. Inside of the cells, we've got a data grid cells panel. Eventually, a data grid cell is the container for a single cell. There's our content presenter again, the thing that's going to render out our data context for that cell. The other thing to note here, that we'll talk about more in the data grid section of this module, notice there's no column objects anywhere here. Columns don't really exist in terms of the object model of a data grid at runtime. They're explicitly part of the way you declare the data grid at design time, but the rendering actually happens at a row level and then walking across the cells of a row, not in a column-oriented fashion. And this really emphasizes the pivotal role of the items presenter here and the content presenter here for dynamically rendering out the data-driven content of a data-bound control.